Dorothy Lathrop was born in Albany, New York in 1891 to businessman Cyprus Lathrop and Ida Lathrop, who worked with success as a painter. Her mother's artistic genes also found their way into both Dorothy and her younger sister Gertrude, who went on to become a sculptor. Dorothy's childhood interests in and passion for drawing wildlife and fantasy images led her to study art at Pennsylvania Academy and the Art Students League. She had also trained to be a teacher, and that's how she began her working life. But in 1918, at the age of 27, she created illustrations for a book titled Japanese Prints by John Gould Fletcher, which despite the title was in fact a collection of Japanese poetry. This commission was a strange but rather fascinating collection of images by Lathrop, ranging from simple bold line drawings through to finely stippled monochromes and an isolated colour frontispiece, all in an orientally influenced style. A year later, and much more significantly for her career, more of her work was published in Walter de la Mare's book The Three Mulla Mulgars. Although of different generations, the writer and illustrator apparently got on well, and she would create images for more of his books in the years that followed. The book told the story of three monkey brothers who set off on an adventure to find their father, and Lathrop threw herself into the project with considerably attractive results. Although the book did feature some fine stippled black and white illustrations, this commission gave her far more opportunities to work in colour, and her ink and wash images were quite stylistically mannered and composed, revealing some influence of both Kai Nielsen and Harry Clarke. 1920 saw the publication of another fantasy story, A Little Boy Lost by W. H. Hudson, with a series of quite sparse but effective monochromes as chapter headings. But as with the Mulla Mulgars, it was the full-colour pages which had the greatest visual impact. Line work was evident as the foundation of all these illustrations, but it was remarkably finely drawn to allow the glowing delicacy of the colours to at least superficially define the image. This was a wistfully romantic fantasy tale for children, and Lathrop's luminous images were the perfect accompaniment. Unsurprisingly, the book was another popular success, which enhanced her reputation as a children's illustrator of considerable merit. This in itself must have been a time-consuming project, but even so, in the same year she also created stippled monochromes for a translation of the book Grimm, The Story of a Pike, written by Danish author Sven Fleuron. In 1922 she returned to the writing of Walter de la Mare for Down a Down Derry, a collection of fairy-themed poems for children. The book did feature a small number of her evocative and enchanting colour pages, but there were many more monochrome line-only drawings to accompany most of the poems. These were rendered in Lathrop's distinctive blend of stipple and hatched pen technique, but they were no less engrossing than the colour work, and it imbued them all with a distinctive atmospheric and illuminated appeal. Only a year later, another work by de la Mare, a fairy play titled Crossings, was published, featuring more illustrations from Lathrop. Other than the cover, they were monochromes, which in this instance largely dispensed with tonality in favour of a graceful visual simplicity, redolent of the clean styling of Aubrey Beardsley. It was also in 1923 that she created some even more striking, similarly styled monochromes for The Grateful Elephant, an Indian-themed story written by Eugene Burlingame. Once more she put her textural stipple technique aside in favour of a more formal simplicity, which again tapped into her inner Beardsley with great success. And as a bonus, the book featured a solitary but particularly appealing and suitably Eastern full-colour frontispiece. The book Silverhorn, a collection of verses written by the young girl poet Hilda Conkling, was published in 1924, and this was yet another project which was very well suited to Lathrop's own fascination for the world of fairies, elves and woodland fantasy. For this book she created a collection of quite complex pen and ink full-page images, and a similar number of simpler spot images which accompanied the actual verses. Treasure of Carcassonne had originally been published in the later 1800s in France by the writer and illustrator Albert Robida. Lathrop's 1926 edition of the story was a highly distinctive and more minimalist take on the original, with dramatically composed monochromes and only a small amount of hatching to create tonal effects. And continuing her remarkable run of creative productivity, in the same year, her illustrations for Tales from the Enchanted Isles by Ethel May Gate followed the identical pattern with some highly effective aquatically themed bold fantasy monochromes. At this point, Lathrop and her publishers were patently sticking to what had become somewhat of a demonstrably successful formula, and in 1927 her visualisation of Mopsa the Fairy by Jean Ingelow was published. And it too featured many charming, quite boldly rendered black and white illustrations, which played safe and stuck to the expected graphic approach. 1927 was also the year in which her visualisation of another originally late Victorian fantasy, The Princess and Curdie, by George MacDonald, was published. And this by now tried and trusted formula was used yet again for yet another popular success. Following this remarkably prolific run, 1928 came and went with apparently nothing published, but she had not been resting, and in 1929 two more books with Lathrop's illustrations appeared. The Long Bright Land by Edith Howes was a collection of dramatically illustrated myths and folk tales from the South Pacific Islands. And the second of that year was Rachel Field's Hitty, Her First 100 Years, the fictional story of a doll. Despite the inanimate nature of the protagonist, this book in particular proved to be immensely popular. And in addition to the expected cleanly executed line illustrations, there were a few colour pages which saw a return to her delicate application of watercolour washes. 1930 was another year which saw the publication of two books, and although Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Snow Image was a charming mix of colour washes and black and white scenes, it was undoubtedly overshadowed by Lathrop's own fantasy tale, The Fairy Circus. The book contained line drawings which returned her skillful expressive use of stippled penwork to successfully create illuminated effects. But the real triumphs of this book were the equally illuminated full-colour pen and wash images. Each of these featured crowded scenarios of fairy folk and animals engaged in the staging of the woodland circus. And everyone commanded the attention of the young reader and drew them into this enchanting fantasy world. Understandably, it was one of her greatest commercial and creative successes. 1933's The Little White Goat was another of her own stories, a charming inconsequential little fantasy tale in which the little woolly protagonist was joined by two young children and a supporting cast of other endearingly rendered animals. It's worth mentioning that in addition to her illustrated books, Lathrop also worked as an artist with some success, and she acquired a particularly strong reputation for the meticulous wildlife wood engravings she produced as limited edition prints. Her next published authored and illustrated work was 1935's Who Goes There? This was another work of fiction, but it dispensed with fantasy in favour of a more credible woodland story, with a collection of convincing, highly textured drawings of exclusively animal characters, which although appealing were highly plausible in anatomical terms and created with no hint of anthropomorphism. The following year's Bouncing Betsy about the adventures of a lamb also featured anatomically correct portrayals of the animals, but like the earlier Little White Goat, it manifestly set out to bring out as much cuteness in the characters and their interaction as possible. But this ingredient was conspicuously absent in the same year's Fierce Face, The Story of a Tiger, by Dan Gopal Mukherjee. This was an ideal opportunity for Lathrop to once again demonstrate her flair for imbuing wild animals with character while keeping them anatomically representational. And although written for children, the images occasionally displayed an unvarnished depiction of the harsher, more combative elements of life in the jungle. In 1937, Lathrop illustrated the book Animals of the Bible with text by Helen Dean Fish, where animals played roles of varying levels of significance, and although far from red in tooth and claw, they nevertheless avoided the sentimentality of some of her own stories. In 1939 she returned to Indian fiction with her illustrated edition of The Happy Flute by Santram Mandal. This was a spiritually inclined and sensitive narrative with some fantasy elements, but continued to use faithful representations of all characters in the story. And as with so much of her monochrome work, the balance of solid black, page white and transitional toning techniques was immaculately carried out. 1939 was also the year in which Lathrop's dazzling watercolour visualisation of Hans Andersen's The Little Mermaid was published. And although many others, including the finest illustrators of the Golden Age, had beaten her to it, Lathrop's was an unforgettably magical evocation, created in bright, strikingly illuminated washes of watercolour, a formal semi-representational approach to anatomy, and compelling compositions, all of which combined to defy the reader to leave the image and turn the page. There were also some stippled monochromes, which were skillfully executed with a particularly light touch, but in this instance they could not compare to the thrilling nature of the colour pages. Following this major achievement, Lathrop almost entirely abandoned the fairy tale side of her output and devoted herself predominantly to wildlife and animal-themed stories. In 1940 she both wrote and illustrated Presents for Lupe, a charming little narrative concerning a South American red squirrel rescued and adopted by two children. But unusually the illustrations, created with convincingly textural application of coloured pencil, were more like wildlife studies than the expected narratives, and involved no scene setting or other characters. 1941's The Colt from Moon Mountain was another of her own stories, which, like earlier works such as The Little White Goat, involved an endearing young animal and two equally endearing young children, in a woodland setting, executed entirely in stippled pen and ink. A year later, Mr. Bumps and His Monkey, another story from Walter de la Mare, was published, for which Lathrop created a collection of fascinating textured colour illustrations. The story concerned a sailor who befriends a talking monkey and they go to sea together, but as with Presents for Lupe, nobody other than the monkey actually featured in her illustrations, which were again created not as watercolour washes, but as colour pencil drawings, obviously produced on highly textured paper using a limited colour palette. At this later stage of her career, this had evidently become her favoured technique and medium, and she used it again with success in her own 1943 book Puppies for Keeps, with some amusing and again credible two-colour textured images of the Pekingese stars of the show at play, once more without benefit of humans, even though they actually featured in the written narrative. In 1945, Lathrop returned to a monkey theme with her own tale, The Skittle Scattle Monkey, and this was another exclusively animal cast, all of whom were created with considerable authority in black and white grainy pencil. But despite her current fondness for this approach, in the same year she also illustrated a collection of children's verse titled Song Under the Silver Umbrella, with a return to her simpler, less tonally informed pen and ink drawings. In 1947 she published An Angel in the Woods, featuring a central character which, just as in the earlier doll story Hitty, was not brought to life, but was the central inanimate element around which the creatures of the forest could gather and engage with. By this point Lathrop was now in her 60s, and it seemed she had finally decided to slow down somewhat. Nevertheless, in 1954 she returned to her beloved Pekingese dogs with the story of Puffy and the Four-Leaf Clover. Her next didn't appear until 1960, which was Follow the Brook, a return to monochrome graphite rendering, and another collection of credible evocations of a group of raccoons and other wildlife. And she did it again only a year later with the book Let Them Live. But as the title indicates, this wasn't a work of fiction, but a series of images of wildlife drawings to accompany text, which made a case for the preservation of America's wilder habitats and the animals who populate them. And as such it was quite an early ecological warning and an indication of her depth of feeling on the subject. Lathrop's last published book was a strange but compelling departure titled The Dog in the Tapestry Garden. It was published in 1962 and composed more like a series of medieval tapestries than an actual story, but clearly showed her creative imagination was as strong as it had always been. Following this, she retired completely and died in Falls Village, Connecticut at the age of 89 in 1980. During her lifetime, she'd illustrated almost 40 books, about 10 of which she also wrote. Needless to say, I haven't featured them all here, and some of them I failed to find usable evidence to show, but I like to think it's a fairly representative selection. And I'm pleased to see her work is on display in various museums in the USA, including New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. And here are a few more of her pictures I couldn't make room for earlier to end with.